And it's a pleasure to have all of you with us today. I would kindly request that everyone put their microphone on mute. So please mute yourselves. My name is Olayinka Makimba, and I head the Competence Center Agribusiness at the Delegation of German Industry and Commerce. We're happy to welcome you to the fourth edition of our monthly webinar series. The webinar series is organized by the Delegation of German Industry and Commerce and supported by SDG Market Building, an initiative by GIZ. With us today are Zainab Dati from SDG Market Building, who will be speaking about who they are and what they do. And then we have two really experienced and fantastic cocoa processors and people who use Nigerian cocoa in their production to share about their experience and how they are managing post-harvest losses. The webinar series is a monthly series that we've been implementing for well over a year now. We've looked at cashew, we've looked at fruits and vegetables. We're looking at crops such as maize and rice and cassava later on in the year. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome, and we do hope that it isn't your last time joining. A bit of housekeeping, because that, of course, is always necessary and important. We ask that all participants please keep their videos and their microphones off. Our speakers will show their faces and unmute themselves when they speak. If you have any questions regarding anything that they'll be sharing, please type your questions in the chat. We have reserved about 15-20 minutes at the end of our webinar to address any of your questions. We're looking forward to a really interactive and engaging webinar. So please don't hold back with your questions, write them into the chat, and we'll pick them up either during the session itself or, as I said, at the very end of the webinar. For your information also, we are recording the webinar. The webinar will be made available on our YouTube channel. So please do feel free to share the link afterwards within your circle of friends or colleagues for them to return to this webinar as well. The presentations that we will be sharing or that we will be viewing today, we will be sharing with you afterwards as well. So don't worry, you don't have to take notes. We'll be happy to share the presentations by our two speakers today with you later on. As I said, my name is Yinka Makimo. I have the Competence Center Agribusiness at the delegation. The delegation has been in Nigeria for over 40 years, for 41 years actually, and we have offices in Abuja and Lagos. Apart from agribusiness, we look into vocational training. We have competence centers focusing on skills development, on digitalization and energy and environment, on market entry and support. We are your friends, your partners in Nigeria. So if you'd like to find out more about who we are and what we do in Nigeria and beyond, since we are part of a larger organization that is represented in over 140 locations, please do feel free to get in touch with us as well afterwards, or follow us on our social media channels to find out more about who we are and what we do. But our focus today is post-harvest losses, and we're looking specifically into cocoa, and we are very excited about an engaging webinar today. I would like to hand over now to Zainab Dati, who will be speaking to us about SDG Market Building, and we will be sharing her presentation and contact information afterwards as well. So feel free to reach out to her bilaterally to find out more about how SDG Market Building can support you and your business endeavors. Thank you so much. Over to you, Zainab.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I just have a slide I want to show the presentation. The full presentation will be shared, but right now I just have a slide just to introduce and keep it short. Just give me a second to show that. Okay, so here we go. Could you let me know if you can see my screen? I can't hear anyone. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen. Yes, yes.
Okay. So I'm a country representative for the SDG Market Building, which is an initiative for investment promotion for green tech solutions in agriculture in Africa. So in a nutshell, my name is Zainab Dati, as I said. The GIZ is implementing the project here in Nigeria. And so what is the SDG Market Building? It is commissioned by the Federal Ministry of Economic Development and Cooperation in Germany to contribute to a greener economy, resource efficiency, and reduction of agricultural loss, as well as reduced hunger and creation of jobs. We do this by providing support to your business to invest in efficient and climate smart green tech solutions. We're currently in Nigeria and Kenya. This is still a pilot project. So we're in these two countries to see how the project goes. And how do we do this? How do you know if this is right for you? Well, these are our target groups. We have medium-sized farms and producers, aggregation levels, like unions and associations, farm unions and associations and cooperatives. And we're looking at also licensed warehouses, mostly medium-sized as well, because it's easier to deal with them as opposed to the larger ones, which tend to be already funded well or not even really looking for our services. And we also have to ask the question, what technologies are you looking for? What support are you looking for? So we support these 3 technologies at the moment. Irrigation, so we're talking about climate smart, smart irrigation systems on your farm to reduce, obviously, water use and improve production. We're looking at post-harvest mechanization, such as introducing smart mechanization or automation for like milling, threshing, and the likes of it to obviously reduce post-harvest losses and improve the quality of the products, the end product. And we're also looking at agrivoltaics, which is pretty, I guess, a new technology in that sense. It's about dual land use. So not only to provide electricity to the farm and environment or whatever is connected to the solar PV, but also to protect the soil and crops and reduce evapotranspiration, which is loss of water from the crop's surface and as well as the soil surface, which will obviously improve the soil moisture. We do this. This is just a simple sort of introduction, what's it called? This is just a simple overview of how we do it. We do this by identifying the business. We do a site visit to see what is the possible collaboration or what we could offer and what you're looking for. We draft your investment dossier. We see where the possibilities to match with tech providers or to match with suitable finance partners. We do not finance, but we are working with different financial bodies to try and find financial partners for you. We support you freely. We do a project. We provide free project of business.
Excuse me, please put your microphones on mute, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Free project and business development services. So this is your investment, your ROI. We just provide the free support until, we match, but we're there along the way as long as you need us to be part of the process. We have a platform that we use to connect businesses, to connect our off-takers with businesses. And this platform will introduce you to technology providers internationally and as well as locally, so we please encourage you to sign up on Leverage. So this is what Leverage looks like. These are some of the two projects we have on Leverage right now. So any technology providers, solution providers that are actually on this call, we encourage you to please sign up on Leverage. I will put the link onto the chat so that you can see what it looks like. You can sign up. So when there's any sort of business opportunity you're looking to work with or to invest in, to work in, then it'll be really good to see you there. So that's my introduction to SDG market building, but Yinka will share a more in-depth presentation with you all after the webinar. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Zainab. Thank you so much. It's been very informative. And like she said, and like I said earlier as well, we will be sharing those slides. So for those individuals just joining, please switch off your cameras. Please switch off your cameras and your microphones. We'll only have our speakers share their cameras and the microphones. And as we're starting now, I'd like to invite Uzo Amaka from Loom Chocolate for her presentation. Over to you, Uzo. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yinka. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Is Wisdom there to put up the presentation, or should I give it a go?
Wisdom, please put up the presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I think we can go to the next page. So thank you very much for having me. I'll do a little bit of an introduction of myself and my company, and then we can dig in. So my name is Uzo Igweke, and I'm the founder of Loomcraft Chocolate. I studied electronic engineering in the University of Nigeria in Nsukka, and I also have a postgraduate certificate in business administration from the Alliance Manchester Business School. So for 12 years of my career, that's most of my career, I worked as an SAP consultant, specializing in procurement and manufacturing. I'm passionate about entrepreneurship, and that's why I decided to focus on entrepreneurship full time. And I'm currently learning how to innovate so that I can solve like real problems for the community. My interests, they change over time, and I'm currently learning how to swim. Next page, please. So a little bit about our company. Loomcraft Chocolate is a cocoa processing company. We are based in Abuja, Nigeria, and we basically focus on transforming Nigerian cocoa beans into high quality chocolate products. These include chocolate bars, chocolate chips, spreads, and we also do cocoa and cocoa butter. Very importantly, we put the spotlight on other Nigerian produce like sugar, coffee, cashews, sesame by incorporating them into our products. So a little bit about our journey. We kicked off commercial production and supplies in June 2020, and in that year, we processed less than half a ton of cocoa beans. But in 2022, we'll process a monthly average of about 1 ton of cocoa beans per month, and our products are stocked in over 70 stores across several cities in Nigeria. So before we dig into the matter of post-harvest losses in the cocoa, I think it's important for me to take you through the cocoa processing for chocolate from our point of view. So when we start a day in the life of our factory, these are the different processes that we go through to make chocolate. Thank you. These are different processes we go through to make chocolate, and I feel like it's important to understand or to get an overview so that when I talk about the losses, it's clearer. So we basically source our cocoa beans mainly from the southwestern parts of Nigeria, from Osun State and Ondo State. We also get some cocoa from Edo State and Cross River State, but the bulk of our cocoa comes from the southwest. So there's a bit of, there's some distance between where we source the cocoa and where we actually process it. So it's transported to us, to our factory in Abuja, and the first step basically is to sort the cocoa beans. And the essence of sorting the cocoa beans is to remove any undesirable material or content. It could be cocoa beans themselves, or even sometimes you find sticks, stones, metals, all sorts of funny things inside a batch of cocoa. But it's very important to sort out so that you can remove anything that will affect the texture, the flavor, anything that is plain undesirable and unhealthy in the cocoa. Then after sorting out the good beans, the next step is to roast it. So we roast under very specific conditions, because the roasting is not just about cooking up the cocoa beans. There are several factors that make it very important. And one is that the high heat helps to kill any living thing, any microorganisms that may be in the cocoa. Also, it's very important for flavor development as well. So to get optimal flavor in the final chocolate product, then you need to roast at optimal temperatures. And depending on the cocoa, where it's sourced from, you could have and maintain different roast profiles as well. So how long you roast it for, and for how high or low the temperature is. Then immediately after roasting, we allow it to cool, and then we crack. So the essence of cracking is to help us separate the papery shell of the cocoa beans from the actual kernel the beans. So I'll use the term kernel and nibs interchangeably. They just mean the same thing. It means basically the useful parts of the cocoa bean, the part that is useful for chocolate making. Every part of the chocolate of the cocoa pod is very useful. So we crack to separate the husk from the kernel, and then after that we winnow. So the process or the mechanism of winnowing is basically sending a jet of air to separate the husks from the kernels or the nibs. And then when that is done, we then refine the cocoa nibs. So at this stage, we are basically grinding the cocoa nibs into a very smooth paste that we use to make chocolate. So, and apart from, the breakdown, the physical breakdown of the particle size of the cocoa nibs, it's also very important for flavor development and gives you an opportunity to incorporate other ingredients like milk or sugar or any other ingredients that will add flavor to your chocolate. Then after refining, we go through a process that is called tempering. If you're familiar with how steel and metals work, you may be familiar with the term, and it basically means essentially the same thing. You're trying to condition the chocolate so that it's hard. I mean, when you take a chocolate bar and you break it into two, there's this satisfying snap you get. And that's because, or that comes from the process of tempering. And it's basically fat crystals inside the chocolate being set in a very specific structure that is firm and hard. So that tempering process basically takes the temperature of the chocolate up and brings it down a bit. There are very specific temperatures for the tempering process, but the end result is chocolate bars that you can wrap and then distribute to the end users. Next slide, please. Okay, so we talk about cocoa loss, and basically cocoa loss from the point of view of the chocolate maker is anything that let's say reduces the complete value or the complete waste of the useful cocoa that we started with. So the very first point of cocoa loss in our process flow is in sorting. And during sorting, we might lose up to 30% of the starting weight. And there are several reasons why we have this loss. And the first one is moldy beans. So moldy beans refers to chocolate, or cocoa beans rather, that have some fungal growth on the surface and sometimes inside the kernel. When you break open the beans, right, you find that mold is already growing inside. And this is because the cocoa has either not been stored properly or has not been transported properly. And the conditions for storage and transportation is suboptimal, and it encouraged fungal growth, basically, or living organisms. So it includes moisture and warmth. So when you have moisture in your point of storage, or there's a point of there's an introduction of water or moisture into the cocoa beans during storage or transportation, then it will make it an ideal host for microorganisms, and then you get fungal growth. And when you have moldy beans, of course, you cannot use that for making chocolate or anything for consumption. So it has to go out. So that's one point of the cocoa loss. And then you also have infested beans. So in this case, a very obvious sign is having holes inside the cocoa beans. So these holes are actually bored in by insects, all manner of insects, weevil, and so on and so forth. But when you have a situation like that, of course, you can't use the cocoa beans, so you have to take it out. And this particular problem can affect a huge number or a huge quantity of your beans. For example, if it's stored in bags, once weevils have access, or insects have access to the beans, they multiply so fast, and in certain cases you have to abandon the entire bag of cocoa. So this forms a very huge loss. In this case, you're looking at 100% loss if you're working with a bag. It's way more than 30%. So that's another source of loss. Then when you come to the actual bean itself, in certain cases, you have what we call flat beans. So flat beans are beans that, that basically don't have any kernel or any nib inside, and it's useless for making chocolate. And you need to sort it out so that it doesn't even get into your process. It doesn't get into your process flow. And this also applies to small beans as well. Beans that are too small means that they will roast faster than the beans of the average size, and sometimes even get burnt, and it just impacts negatively on the flavor of the final product. So flat beans are removed. And then you have cases like this where you have clustered beans as well. It's a defect from the fermentation process, basically. So beans, immediately after beans are harvested, basically, they have to go through certain processes in situ that's at the farms or very close to the farms. And it includes basically fermentation and drying. So in those cases, if you don't turn properly, because during fermentation, you have to turn the beans daily to ensure that fermentation is happening uniformly across the entire batch. So in cases where it's not turned properly, you have clustered beans. And of course, these are not good for your final product, so you also have to remove them as well. So that's it for sorting. Next page, please. So another point of cocoa loss is in the roasting, right? And something I must say is that these losses, right, there are some that have to be controlled at the farms or at the fermentation sites. There are also some that are within the control of the processor, in this case the chocolate maker. So for roasting, we experience losses here due to over roasting and under roasting, and I'll explain both of them. But basically, during roasting, what happens is that the husk separates from the kernel or the nib. It's just the same way you would have groundnuts, for example. So if you roast groundnuts, you see how easily the husk can be separated from the nut itself, and that's because of the roasting process. So it helps us separate the husk from the kernel. So for over roasting, right? Over roasting is a situation where you roast it longer than you should have, or at a higher temperature than you should have. The result is burnt beans, and a single burnt bean can impact the flavor of an entire batch of chocolate. So if you have a batch that is burnt, beans that are burnt, you have to take them out, and that introduces loss of cocoa. Then you also have under roasting. In this case, the reverse is the case. Basically, you don't roast it for long enough, and you roast it for too short a time. So what happens is that it's very difficult for you to remove the husk from the bean. And because you can't have husks inside your chocolate making machine, then of course you have to remove it. You have to discard it as well. So that's it for roasting. Next slide, please. Then we come to winnowing. So basically, after you've roasted your cocoa beans, the next step, if you remember, is cracking it so that you can easily winnow. So if you think about the previous step on the roasting, right? When you on the roast, right, your husk is still attached to the bean, and even when you crack, it still remains attached to the bean, right? So that's where you lose cocoa, because you have to separate under roasted cocoa from properly roasted cocoa. Then for winnowing, right, the preceding step, cracking, basically introduces tiny
Uzomaka, are you there? We've lost you. Apologies, it seems to be a network issue. Uzomaka, we cannot hear you. Uzomaka, are you there? Okay, we seem to have lost her. We'll try and get her back as soon as possible. In the meantime, I would ask you to please use the chat to share your questions. There has been quite a bit of input already. Uzomaka, is that you? Are you back?
Yes, I'm back. Sorry, I lost my network for a bit. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
So,
Please go
so I
ahead.
was talking about it. This is the step that follows cracking, and during that cracking process, if you crack too finely, right, you get very tiny of cocoa that we call cocoa dust. We call it cocoa dust because a little bit of air pressure sends it away, right? So the winnowing process basically works on the principle that the husk of the bean is lighter than the nib of the bean. So air is introduced into a chamber, right, and drives off the very light husk while reserving or retaining the heavier nibs. So if you crack too finely, then you would see that your cocoa nibs, which is actually more of particles and dust, weigh as light um, as maybe the cocoa husk. And in that process of winnowing, you lose all that cocoa. It's actually good cocoa, but just because it has been cracked too finely, you lose it in the winnowing step. So that's another source, basically another source of cocoa loss in winnowing. And at that point, you may lose up to 10% of your starting weight. So if the extra care needs to be taken in the preceding step to ensure you don't have too much loss during the winnowing. Next slide, please. So the picture here basically is the cocoa after cracking. You make it after cracking, and the picture of the cocoa nibs after the winnowing step. Next slide, please. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we'll talk a bit about minimizing cocoa loss at processing. So what we've discussed basically are the different points where cocoa loss is introduced to our process flow. But how can we minimize cocoa loss at processing? The first step is in fermentation and in drying. Best practices for fermentation and drying have to be used. The cocoa pods, first of all, they have to be sorted, because if you start with bad cocoa pods, then you end up with bad beans that are not properly fermented, that are flat, that are too small. So the cocoa pods must be sorted at site. And then during fermentation, the best practice is that you turn every day at a specific time. So if you start turning at, when I mean turning, or when I say turning, what I mean is just moving or agitating the cocoa beans in your fermentation box. So you have to move it around to make sure that temperature is evenly distributed, and that the fermentation is happening uniformly across board. So you have to turn daily during fermentation, and this will reduce the amount of clustered beans that you have as well. Then also raised platforms have to be used during fermentation. So the common practice, especially with farmers in Nigeria, is to do the fermentation on the ground, right? But you should actually ferment in boxes, and then when you're drying the cocoa as well, you use raised platforms so that your cocoa beans is not lying on the floor, because it's at that point that you can introduce several microorganisms and even insects. Then another point where we can actually reduce cocoa loss is improper storage, right? Cocoa beans, they have to be stored in jute bags in a location that is well ventilated and dry. So for us in the factory, what we do is that we use plastic pallets to lift the bags off of the floor. And then you have to maintain a certain distance between the walls and the cocoa beans itself. So have your windows open. It has to be properly ventilated. Windows on both sides of the room, raised platforms, and a distance from the wall. So this helps you. And then also fumigation from time to time is also beneficial to eliminate any insects that may be around. So because insects, cocoa loss through insects, it's a huge source of cocoa loss. So we also sun dry our beans. So sometimes when you get the beans from the farms, you find out that it's not properly dried, and it will benefit from some extra drying. So we also dry at the factory to further reduce the moisture content of the beans, and also prevent the activity of microorganisms. Then during roasting, of course, extra care has to be taken at roasting, so you don't under roast or over roast. And it's even to your own benefit as a chocolate maker that you roast optimally. It's not just about preventing cocoa loss, it's also about optimal flavor development as well. Then another source, which is cracking, is that you have to, of course, crack optimally. Sometimes you may need to experiment with 100 grams to get your cracker properly set up, so that you minimize loss. It cracks at just the right pressure and doesn't generate so much cocoa waste that gets blown off at winnowing. So basically, that's it from our point of view in a nutshell, cocoa loss at processing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Uzomaka. That has been really informative and very insightful. So thank you so much for joining us and presenting the history of the journey of Loom Chocolate, and also really digging into the topic of post-harvest losses. Our second speaker, unfortunately, is having connection issues, which isn't necessarily a problem, because I do feel that you managed to cover so many different elements. And so the topic is well covered. I want to give the audience an opportunity to prepare some of their questions in response to your presentation, so we can really dig into the subject matter. But whilst participants do that, I have some questions that I would like to ask you as the audience gets ready to write their own questions into the chat. So you mentioned that you source your cocoa from, I think, 2 or 3 different states in Nigeria. What informed your choice of your source? So how did you go about finding the right partner to get your cocoa from?
Okay, so when we started, it was basically family and friends connect. Do you know who grows cocoa? And that's how I got the first my first source of supply. Then as you make chocolate and you also talk about it on social media, certain farmers also approach you as well, right? But the bulk, my base source of cocoa is actually from word of mouth, like my family and friends. Okay, I know this person that does cocoa. And then also exploring, like going to those states as well, also gives you access to smallholder cocoa farmers as well. So that's how we developed our list of sources: word of mouth, social media, and exploration into the farms.
Great. So I'm curious to find out a bit more about how that relationship over the last 2 or 3 years has developed with those cocoa farmers that you were sourcing from. So you mentioned that you had experienced losses when it comes to poor storing practices. You've had infestations, you've had fungal infestations, you've had a lot of mold growing. What do you do at that point where you receive those pods that are not usable? And how does that affect the bottom line? What do you do? How does poor cocoa beans, or what you have received, affect your relationship going forward? Do you pay them for the beans that aren't usable to you? How does it affect your bottom line? And how do you develop the relationship beyond that? So apart from the financial loss, and of course there's a financial case here, do you then return to the farmers? Do you do some kind of training to help them understand what practice they should implement in order to reduce or mitigate some losses? How does that relationship, or how has that relationship developed?
Okay, so first of all, let me talk about payment, right? We pay for the cocoa before they are shipped. So that's one thing. So it's already paid for. So the moment we get a bad batch, the first thing we do basically is to send a picture to the farmer to say, okay, this is what has happened. And also, as we learned, as we worked more with cocoa over past couple of months, we've learned a lot about cocoa, and we've been in a better. We also talked to other cocoa farmers, even outside of Nigeria, and that has placed us in a better position to better educate the farmers on what needs to be done and what should not be done. Then, so basically that's it. We bear the financial losses. There's nothing we can do about that. And you see that because, we're developing very mutually beneficial relationships with the farmers, sometimes they actually do send you extras on the next purchase to kind of make up for a bad batch. But the key for us is that line of open communication, right? That line of learning. Let me put it that way. There was a year, I think it was in 2020, I actually took a tour of some of the farms, and I was able to interact with the farmers and tell them what I had learned, what the best ideal practices and the best practices should be. So they too love the relationship and they want to keep the relationship. So you see that they implement these right practices and also try to compensate you in cases of loss.
Okay, great. You had spoken about storage and the need for ventilation, raised platforms, jute bags. If you look at other crops, and we have that, I think a very basic example would be cashew, for instance, where processors work very closely with producers and supply them with some of those needs that they have. So say, for instance, in cashew, we know that Olam provides jute bags to the farming communities that they work with, simply because they see the importance of proper ventilation and storage. Is that something that you have done as Loom Chocolate, or that you are considering, supplying your farmers potentially with raised platforms as you have them, or jute bags, in order to minimize some of those losses?
So at the moment, we haven't started supplying our farmers with tools and resources that they need, because we ourselves are also just starting, right? We're a relatively new company. So, but where we're able to provide the support, which is in terms of learning and training, but we do have plans in the future to actually support the farmers with these tools that they need. In fact, that was what prompted my visit to the farms the last time I went there, was because I could see the differences in cocoa beans, right? You have this farm doing things the way it should be done, executing best practices and giving you excellent beans. Then you have another farm nearby that is not doing what should be done, and you get bad beans. Ultimately, I want good beans. So the trigger for that trip was to see what these people were doing right and to try and transfer that knowledge to the farmers that were not doing it correctly. So basically, that's it. Not yet. We don't supply any resources to the farmers apart from knowledge, but in the future we have plans of doing that.
Great, fantastic. Before I continue with my questions, I'm going to go into the chat. There have been quite a few questions coming in from participants, so thank you so much. And please keep your questions coming. A side note, please keep all your microphones on mute. So if your microphone isn't on mute, please do put yourself on mute. Thank you. We have a question from Jeffrey from GIZ Nigeria. Who bears the cost of bad beans after buying from the farmer without knowing? I think you have addressed it, but perhaps you can respond to that in one sentence.
Okay, so largely we bear the cost. In certain cases, very rarely ever, the cocoa farmers will actually send you extra beans to make up for a previous bad batch, but we bear the cost.
Okay. Another question from the same Jeffrey is, do you cooperate with fabricators or engineers to develop adequate cracking methods?
Adequate what?
Cracking.
Okay. So we're currently collaborating with a technology center in Abuja, a collaboration between Israel and the Vice President's office to help us with machines generally. So for cracking, what we do is that we use the locally fabricated cracker, what you would usually call a Victorian mill. So we already have a local source of cracking machines, but we're open to options, because even the Victorian mill, it's actually made for finer grinding. So we have to adjust the machine a bit to get what we need, but we still have significant losses with it. So we're open to collaborations with equipment fabricators locally.
Great, thank you. There's a question from Victor Balogun, who manages a 200-acre cocoa farm in the Southwest, and he has a question around backward integration. So he says, we are in dire need of labor to work on the farms. Do you have any suggestions here in regards to backward integration?
Okay, he's in dire need of labor. I think that's a huge problem, right? Because, you know, farming, especially cocoa farming, is not as lucrative as it should be. I feel like everybody should be going back to farming. While I'm not sure how to answer the question of labor, right? I feel like if we pay more for the cocoa, then we give people incentives to work on cocoa farms. So for backward integration, right? I for now, we don't have plans of owning our own farms yet, because we feel that in Nigeria we should be processing more cocoa, and there's still so much cocoa that we have we have available for processing. So instead of working to own our own farms, we prefer to work with farmers to improve their output so that we can offtake from them.
Thank you. There's another question here saying, do you currently have, or do you have future plans to have supply chain arrangements with farmers for regular supply of cocoa beans to your factory? So any long-term arrangements with suppliers?
So if you follow us on Instagram or social media, you'll see that we try to put out calls for farmers, right? So we're actually looking for smallholder farmers to partner with, to work with, so that we always have a constant supply of good beans. So if you know any, or if you're one, please reach out to me after this. I'm very, very eager to partner with you.
Awesome. So please do, that's a direct call to all the participants. So please do mobilize your social network, your private and professional network for this. There's a question from Solomon here. To all participants, please put your videos off. Please switch off your videos and your microphones. Thank you. Another question from Solomon is, how do you encourage farmers to follow good post-harvest practices after having supplied a bad batch? So how do you actually encourage them to change their methods and practices?
First of all, the relationship is important to the farmers, right? We don't go out threatening to not buy from them anymore. But what we do is that we show them good beans and what those good beans command, the prices the good beans command. So I actually buy beans at X amount for some people, and for some other sources, I buy it at 2X. So the difference is stark. So there's an incentive for you to actually produce good beans. So that's one of the ways that we encourage them to follow best practices.
Fantastic, thank you. There's a question from Zainab here. So from your experience, what are the most dire needs for the farmers to improve the quality of their beans? Aside from financing, have you looked into technologies and practices needed to improve output quality? So apart from money, what else is needed?
Those tools and resources, when you talk about fermentation boxes, right? You know, eventually it boils down to money. But if you're not giving them cash, right, you can supply fermentation boxes, you can supply raised beds for drying, and so on and so forth. So those are the ways that you can, you know, help farmers. But we haven't done anything like that yet.
Yeah, okay, great. There's a question from Antoinette Sala Phillips. She's asking, what specific features are you looking for when you're selecting your cocoa? What are the specific features that you look out for?
Okay, so we look out for the size, and then, okay, we also taste the beans as well. We look out for low astringency, low acidity, and, you know, a decently sized beans. We know we have the different seasons, right? We have the main crop, and then we have the light crop. We understand, you know, that the light crop will not be as will not meet all the features as the main crop. So we understand that. But in the main crop, we're looking for big beans. We're looking for low acidity, low astringency, right?
Awesome. There's a question from Engineer Nar. He asks, do you think the cocoa off-takers, public and private, are compensating cocoa farmers well to encourage youth to join in? I think this goes directly in response to your questions about the low number of farmers that we have, and also engaging the youth and making them interested again in farming. I remember growing up, I mean, I didn't grow up speaking Yoruba, but one of the first Yoruba songs that I ever learned is that Iwe kiko laisi oko. As in, if you're a Yoruba person, you'll know the song. It talks about the fact that we are farmers, and as Africans, of course, we grew up farming largely. I come from a family of cocoa farmers, and nobody has been farming cocoa in the last 30, 40 years, you know, even excuse me, even though the lands are there. And none of us are interested in going into farming. So I do think that there is a huge case to be made for returning to farming, and to also encourage and mobilize the youth to do so. Why do you feel, or what in your assessment or your experience is the reason for such a low interest amongst our youth to go into farming? And how do you think we can, or they can be encouraged to return into farming?
Sorry, Yinka, please can you repeat the question? I just got back. I was caught up for the past
Okay,
couple.
sure.
Yeah.
So I was just saying that I myself come from a family of cocoa farmers, and we have hectares of land, but we haven't, you know, grown any cocoa, produced any cocoa in the past 2 or 3 decades. And none of us are interested in going into that. So there is a massive case to be made for the disinterest of our youth to go back into farming. How do you think they can be mobilized and encouraged to return into farming? And that doesn't just relate to cocoa, but generally.
I think most people are actually looking for a source of income. That's the thing, and if it's not worth it for them, then they won't go in. So I think the obvious thing is cocoa pricing, basically, right? You can't be paying peanuts for cocoa beans, and I think that if we have processors, more processors in the country, right, local processors, it will help address that problem a bit, right? Because first of all, you would have you would have more control. I think more control on pricing locally, and farmers can be better compensated. I mean, because when you're working directly with somebody, you feel the person's pain, you know what the person is going through. I mean, it's a way to better compensate them if more people are actually processing in Nigeria. So I mean, it's like a chicken or an egg thing, right? It's a vicious cycle. So we need more processors to get more people interested. And of course, if more people are interested, we had better have people processing the cocoa.
Absolutely.
So, but I mean, that there's serious competition. Most people want to go into tech because that's like big money. So there is competition, but then again, we can't forget that even if we have all the tech in the world, we still have to eat food. So I feel that should be motivation enough.
Absolutely. So we have a question from Sadiq. Part of ways to address the quality issue is going through commodity exchanges where the produce is already graded for the buyer. So rather than going through several farmers and tasting beans to make your selection, just working through commodity exchanges. I mean, we know that you're a smaller processor, but do you have any experience, any knowledge, any insights as to our Nigerian commodity exchange and their use and storage of cocoa?
No, not at all. I deal directly with the smallholder farmers, and I'm happy with that now, because I recompensate them better, right? So I prefer to go with them, and when we are having discussions, if there's something you need changed in the way they process after harvesting, you can talk directly with them and get it done immediately, or get the changes made immediately. So for now, we are happy with working directly with the customers, with the farmers. Yeah.
Okay. Perhaps we can have a show of hands. How many participants in terms of our audience have tasted Loom chocolate before? Can we have a show of hands from the audience of how many of you have tasted Loom chocolate before? Okay, hands are going up. Nice. So if you're familiar with Loom Chocolate, you can check them out on their website or on the Instagram. I'm curious to know a bit more about the kinds of chocolates that you produce. So we know the typical milk chocolate and dark chocolate and all of that, but you have some very distinct flavors. The sesame one is my personal favorite. So I'd like to hear more about how you source those ingredients that you add to your chocolate and what inspires that selection.
Okay. So basically, we went into this business not for the sake of having another chocolate product on the shelves of supermarkets. It's basically to create wealth, right? That's what we're after. And the approach that we've taken is, instead of always being on the exporting of raw material side and importing of finished products, our approach is basically to process locally global standard products that we can export for foreign exchange. So I had to go beyond cocoa, and a clear way for me is to incorporate basically incorporate other Nigerian produce, and basically be a model to any other person that is looking into going into food production or food processing, that really we can do more, much more, with the produce that is grown locally. So we're just using ourselves as a model and an example for any other person that wants to go into food business. So that's the base mechanism. Basically, that's how we got into using other produce apart from cocoa, because we wanted more of our local produce in our products, and to show that we can actually make global standard products with Nigerian grown produce. So we have sesame flavors with sesame, ginger. We have flavors with cashew and coffee. And what we do is, again, trying to foster the SME ecosystem, is we source these raw materials from other processors as well. So we source our coffee from we have coffee coffee farmers that we source from, but we also source from Nigerian brands like Happy Coffee, for example. Our sesame seeds are also sourced from another sesame seed processor in Abuja. The dried mangoes we used is sourced from Nigerian processors as well. So everything is sourced from other SMEs. So that's just the model of our business, and that's how we operate. So we work from, this is what we want to do, this is how we're going to generate revenue, this is how we're going to impact the economy, to finding out the creative ways that we can do that.
Fantastic. I have a couple of more questions. I'm afraid, sorry to the audience, that we cannot deal with all of them, but I'll try and pick out and fish out a few more. In terms of the current exchange rate problem, so there is a question coming in from Jeffrey, where he's asking, does the current exchange rate problem in Nigeria affect your business, especially in pricing? And how do you ensure that the pricing does not affect consumers unfavorably?
Okay, so one thing that we've done by deciding to focus on locally grown produce, locally grown everything, apart from, of course, equipment. One thing we've done is that we've shielded and protected the company from, the risks of foreign exchange fluctuations. So we haven't increased our prices since we started making chocolate in 2020, and that's because we look for sources and alternatives locally. Right. So, for example, when you talk about vegan milks, instead of going for oat milk like most chocolate makers we do, we looked for a Nigerian source, and that's how we happened on fonio, or what we know as acha. So we use that as an alternative to oat milk. So we basically look for Nigerian alternatives so that we're able to source locally, and we don't have any business, or very little business, with the dollar. Where we are exposed on the dollar side is when we have to buy equipment, and we're also working on that as well by partnering with local fabricators to make some of the equipment that we feel we can produce here now.
Fantastic.
So
Thank you so much.
To answer the question, we're not really affected by it yet.
You had mentioned excuse me, trading, I believe, earlier. Have you exported any of your products yet, whether within West Africa or perhaps to the European market or Asia or America? How does your international trade currently look like?
Okay, so we've partnered with a trade house in Kenya, and we've exported just the one time, but we're looking to grow that relationship and to do more numbers with them. We're also working with other regulatory boards like NAFDAC, NEPC, to also find access to markets outside of Nigeria, because that's actually what we want, to getting the dollars instead of taking it out. We want to, source of foreign revenue. So we're working on exports. We've only exported once, and that was to Kenya.
Okay, great. Awesome. I think that's it for now. There are quite a few more questions that I would have loved to ask, but because we are running out of time, I'm going to ask a final question simply because I think it's such an important one, and it also relates back to the work that SDG Market Building does. And something that has affected literally all of us if you are active within the agricultural sector anywhere along the value chain, and that is climate change. How has climate change over the last years affected the product or the quality of the product that you get? And what do you think can be done to mitigate or reduce some of the effects of climate change on the quality of our kernels? So whether that's intensive rainfall or low temperatures, or the fermentation itself, like whatever it is, how do you feel, or what do you feel has the effect of climate change been? And what are little simple, quote unquote, ways to mitigate some of those effects on the produce?
Okay, I was going to say I'll be very pretentious if I try to answer that question. I've been in cocoa for not long enough to have experienced any drastic impact in the cocoa that we use. So we've been processing since 2020, and that is not to say that climate change hasn't affected the quality of cocoa, but it's just that I've not been in it long enough to give a solid answer.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you for your honesty. So I'm just curious, by show of hand, is there anyone in the audience who is a cashew farmer or cashew producer? By show of hands, is that a question that we can perhaps throw to the audience as we are about to close the webinar, just to get some on the ground experience as to the effect that the climate or that climate change has had on your business, your processes, your operations, your bottom line, your financial bottom line? Is there anyone in the audience who is active in cocoa, apologies,
yeah.
in cocoa production? If there is, please unmute yourself. Mr. Bolawa or Mrs. Bolawa Oladokun. Yes, please unmute yourself. Hello, good morning.
Hello.
Can you please
My name
tell
is
us who you are?
Bolawa Oladokun. I am an agribusiness consultant. I am a freelance consultant as of now. I work for John Vent Cocoa Industries in Akure. I also consult for FX Commodities Exchange. I consult for GIZ as well. I've been in cocoa for quite some time, and I can tell you a few things about how climate change has affected cocoa. If that is the question.
Yes, it is. Please go ahead. Thank you, sir.
Okay, you're welcome. Climate change has really affected cocoa in several ways. Rainfall pattern, weather vagaries have actually changed from what we used to know. And this confuses farmers as well as even those who are extension workers to working to guide the said farmers. Uh, Farmers now see what they would expect to happen in the dry season, sometimes in the rainy season. And sometimes what they are expecting to happen in the rainy season, they see in the dry season. So this is how the weather has been. And in terms of drought, excessive drought sometimes has impacted farmers negatively, killing their trees or resulting in prevalence of insect infestation in their orchards. Also, in trying to rehabilitate their farm, farmers require seedlings to plant, and maybe in replacement of gaps in their farm, or as a replacement of an entire farm, or as a new orchard in expansion of their farm work. When farmers plant seedlings these days, they hardly get up to 30% survival, even doing all what they know what to do, following all GAP recommendations. That is, GAP is good agricultural practices. They rarely get 30% recovery, I mean, as in survivor in the field, finally, from the seedlings they plant. All these are effects of climate change. Excessive rain sometimes overrun their farm and kill their trees, young and old. I mean, when the topsoil is wiped away under the, on the ground, and the tree is standing, not able to source anything from the ground, such trees get killed, and their farms get waterlogged sometimes, and that's not good for cocoa. So these are some of the effects of climate change that I can mention immediately.
Thank you so much. That has been very informative. Are you aware of any schemes that are currently being implemented in Nigeria to support farmers here?
Yeah, there are several schemes. There are individual efforts. Companies are supporting farmers, smallholder farmers here and there. Companies who are into cocoa exporting, especially, have outgrower schemes with smallholder farmers, and they support them to implement certain standards. That is sustainable agriculture standard under Rainforest Alliance, which is the commonest in Nigeria. There used to be US, UTZ, which merged with Rainforest Alliance. So now we have Rainforest Alliance. The implementation of Rainforest Alliance help farmers to understand all of these things. And in addition to others like good agricultural practice training, good social practices training, good business practices, good environmental practices training. So all these are able to, help farmer cushion the effect and also prevent the adversity of the climate change on their production.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Bolowo Oladokun. That has been so informative, and thank you for sharing your experience, your insights with us in such an unplanned manner. Thank you so much. I think every single participant has taken something away from what you shared, and we appreciate you sharing your knowledge and expertise. Thank you so much. We've run out of time. This has been a really interesting session. Thank you so much, Mr. Bolowa. And thank you so much to Uzo Amaka and Zainab Dati, who spoke to us previously as well. If you are interested in getting in touch with Uzo Amaka, please feel free to reach out. You can find her on social media, on her website. She has made a call because she is interested in partnering with cocoa farmers directly. So please do reach out to her to explore an opportunity to collaborate. If you are an SME and you would like to receive some support, some guidance, some consulting in terms of mitigating post-harvest losses, whether that's in cocoa or any other crop, please feel free to reach out to Zainab Dati from SDG Market Building at GIZ to connect and figure out and see how she can support you. As I said earlier, we will be sharing the presentation as well as contact details of our speakers today in an email later today. So you can reach out to her, but she's also shared her email address in the chat. So that concludes today's webinar. I hope that you've enjoyed it. Like I said at the very beginning, this is a monthly series where we come together to discuss a couple of crops and post-harvest losses. So our next session holds next month. Again, it's always on the first Wednesday of the month between 10 a.m. and 11 a.m. Nigerian West African time. So thank you so much for your time, and hopefully see you next week. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you,
Goodbye.
Lainka. Goodbye.
Depends on some of these details have Google Assistant usually means Google Update. Google Update. So Google Update tell you the number of steps taken. But it depends on how you set it.